Welcome on into the Utah Blockcast. I'm Steve Bartle, Utah Insider for KSL Sports. Good to be back with you on the Blockcast. Thanks for tuning in, whether on YouTube or on the podcast. Appreciate everybody for supporting the Blockcast. Excited for what's to come this season. We are now 5 Saturdays away from the Utah football 2025 season kicking off. We'll be down there in Pasadena watching the Utes take on the UCLA Bruins August 30th. Man, that's crazy. Time is flying by. And obviously, with it only being 5 Saturdays till the season kicking off, that means fall camp is right around the corner. We are quite literally, knocking on the door of fall camp beginning. I think we'll be up there. I think on Tuesday we're supposed to get the official schedule. That's going to be sent to us on Monday. So I'm anticipating we'll be up there Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday next week. So excited for things to get going. I think it's been a lot of fun to get back, into a pretty consistent groove with the Blockcast, and excited for what we've got planned with this and with what we plan on doing this season with the podcast. Really excited for what's to come. I am grateful for KSL Sports and them providing me the means necessary to do this consistently and to potentially grow this pretty significantly. So really, really excited about the plans that we've got for the podcast and what's coming up this season. So really looking forward to the next couple of weeks and then getting into the season as well. So, on today's episode, I have to power through these position group fall camp previews because fall camp is beginning next week. So on today's episode, I'm going to run through the offensive side of the ball, what we've got left there with the quarterbacks, tight ends, and offensive line position groups. And then on Monday, I'll have another episode recorded for the defensive position groups, which will include the defensive ends, cornerbacks, and safeties. So excited to get to it on this one. But first, a couple of notes to highlight here before we get into things. First, Celeste Moa has a commitment date set for July 31st. This one has been what it's been all month long, and that's Utah versus Tennessee. And it sounds like that's what it's boiling down to for Celeste. It's certainly been, there's been a lot of anticipation. There were a couple of moments where we thought there would be a commitment announced, and those moments came and went. But I think it's important to note that I think Celeste is everything that I've heard on Celeste. He's a very mature kid. He's gone about his recruitment in a manner that I think is respectful to a lot of coaches, to a lot of people, and I think he's gone about things the right way. So regardless of where Celeste ends up, know that he's put a lot of time into this, and this has been more than just your searching for a bag and that type of thing. That's not it at all. I think Celeste has really put a lot of thought into this. Obviously, the Moas have been through this process 2 times before with Sione and Ice, and they know the process really well. And I think Celeste has tremendous potential, not only at the collegiate level, but getting to the professional level. And I think for him, he wants to maximize his opportunity at the next level, not only in the sense of what it means for him at college, but also getting to the next level as well. So obviously looking forward to that. That again, July 31st is when Celeste will announce. And I started the month cautiously optimistic about Utah's chances with Celeste, given the fact that they went on a little bit of a run with Kelvin Obot and the Pula twins to finish up their June recruiting efforts. It seemed like things were trending really positively for Utah with Celeste to potentially land that commitment earlier this month. And as time went on, obviously worry grows, angst grows, and I think even some frustration, maybe even, which is something. But after it was announced that he had a commitment date set for the 31st, I was a little worried, based on a little update that I got. But after a recent conversation, still feeling cautiously optimistic about Utah's chances going into decision day for Celeste. So obviously, we'll see. It would be pretty significant for Utah, as I highlighted in the last episode, what it would mean for Utah and their recruiting class. It would have a significant impact where Utah is currently ranked, I believe, 52nd or somewhere in the 50s, maybe even 49th, given the new update that 24/7 Sports had with their composite, their industry composite. I think Utah is actually 49th in the team ranking. With Celeste added to the class, I think they jump up into the low 30s, 32nd, 33rd nationally. And also, I think they'd land fifth in the Big 12 Conference, which is where Utah needs to be to continue contending and adding the sort of talent that they need to remain competitive at the top of the conference. So that would be pretty significant in that sense. And obviously, for Utah, landing the number one player in the state of Utah has a lot more meaning than what it used to in the Pac-12 era days. Obviously, you always wanted the number one player then, but even more so now with BYU being in the conference and all that sort of stuff. So all that carries a lot more value, and I think Utah fans, again, just like me, should feel cautiously optimistic about Utah's chances in landing that commitment. And then, the big news this week has been President Trump's executive order with college football and all of that. And I think there's been a lot of talk about it. And I think for the most part, what you need to know is that nothing really changes. I think he's essentially making it clear that things need to be done. That he would like that there's an order for representatives and certain departments of Congress to work with the NCAA to find resolutions for collegiate sports to sort of model what it's been in years past. But there is a lot of work on that front. So there's nothing really changes in the short term, and things might change in the long term, but we'll see. But hey, at least President Trump made it clear where he stands on it, and hopefully that gets people going, trending in the right direction towards a resolution that would help alleviate a lot of the issues that plague college sports and college athletics. I shouldn't say plague, but it's good that athletes are getting paid and all that sort of stuff. But I think there's a lot of issues with it that come with it that I think need to be cleaned up. Obviously, I think tampering is one thing. I think just maintaining a level playing field. I think a lot of people, as much as we want players to have the freedom to earn money, I think we all want. I think even players want it to so represent the college game that we all grew up watching and that sort of stuff. So anyways, I think we'll see what happens, but at least there's an order in place to requesting assistance and help to lead to a resolution. So we'll see. But that was the big news this week. So let's get into these three position group previews for fall camp, starting with the quarterback position. Let's get to that. And with Devon Dampier following Jason Beck to Salt Lake City, I think that's pretty significant for Utah. And when you talk about Dampier, his experience, you look at what he was able to accomplish last season. Obviously, we're all familiar with the production: 2,700 rushing yards, 2,700 passing yards, 1,100 rushing yards, 31 total touchdowns. There were a lot of snaps played last year. There were a lot of moments and experiences that Dampier went through with Coach Beck, and I think all of that is valuable for Dampier as he comes to Utah with that experience and knowledge of the playbook. And we saw just how different that was for Dampier compared to the other quarterbacks, Wilson and Ficklin, who were both learning a new offense. We saw just how stark the difference was in terms of where Dampier was with the offense and where the other two were. And that's not to disparage them at all. That's just to highlight the significance of Dampier coming and following Beck to Salt Lake City. I think it's a significant dynamic for Utah that should bode well for the offense and Dampier specifically. So I think there were a lot of really good signs and indications over the course of spring ball. I mentioned this on the podcast that previewed the wide receiver group a couple episodes ago, but the passing game improved more than any other dynamic over the course of spring ball, from where they started week 1 to where they were week 5. We really we saw the chemistry and the production really come together over those final 2 weeks with Dampier at the helm. And with how he performed, in the spring game, there weren't official stats kept, and I think we can all thank Charlie Brewer for that, given given what transpired a couple years ago and all that. But I think I kept tabs, as closely as I could, and I had Dampier for over 250 passing yards and over 50 rushing yards altogether on the day. And it was interesting, his rushing totals. It was typically it was a 10-yard gain, on a 3rd and 8, a 3rd and 7, 2nd and 6, that type of thing, where he's converting first downs, and that's sort of the value with Dampier's rushing production, is that he is typically pulling and running to pick up the sticks, to get to the sticks, to get those first downs, to convert opportunities to move the chains and to keep the offense on the field. I think that is a really significant element that can have a profound effect on the offense and how it looks and how it feels and how much success it leads to. I think Dampier's ability to become even more decisive in those moments as he goes into year 2 under Jason Beck will be really, really important. I think obviously gaining the experience that he did, at New Mexico was valuable, but with Beck too, gaining that experience and learning what Dampier's strengths are, what his weaknesses are, what they need to work on, I think that is also a really exciting dynamic that should lead to positive results for Utah on the offensive side of the ball. So, I think there's a lot of reason to be optimistic about Dampier, and I think one thing that I get really, I don't want to say excited over, but it's hard not to. But looking at how Dampier performed, from a clean pocket, and when he was kept clean at New Mexico, which he was clean 77% of the time. In terms of his total dropbacks, he completed 198 passes out of 312 attempts, which was good for 63.5% completion percentage, which is noticeably different than the 57.5% in total. And those 198 completions went for 2,282 yards, 9 touchdowns, and 5 interceptions. And I think really something that sort of speaks to his ability to perform within structure. And there's been criticism of Dampier and calling him sort of a chaos merchant and him only finding success outside of structure and all that sort of stuff. I think that's pretty, I don't want to say lazy, but I just think people aren't really diving into Dampier and where he had success by saying things like that. Dampier really, again, just sort of evident by the numbers here, on 337 dropbacks, he attempted 312 attempts in a clean pocket for an average time to throw of 2.48 seconds. That speaks to getting the snap, reading, processing, making a throw in 2.48 seconds. That's not chaos. That's not getting out of the pocket. That's not escaping. That's not creating out of structure. That's executing in a timely manner. And so that is something that is a really encouraging thing for me to see that number, that 2.48 seconds, because that speaks to his ability to perform on schedule, on platform, in structure, all of those things that we start to hear with quarterbacks. Because when he gets out of structure, that's where you see the athleticism. That's where you see those wow plays. And I think there's a really encouraging balance here, where you're seeing him, when he's kept clean 77% of the time last year, he's under pressure 22.5% of the time. His ability to escape and create yardage with his legs in those moments, in those pressure situations, I think will be key as well. So Um, I think Dampier is set to really take a good step forward going into year two under Beck. Even given the increase in competition, I do think there will be an adjustment, but I think it's important to grasp that that experience in the system pays dividends. There are so many things that go into a quarterback's ability to perform. How naturally accurate you are as a passer, your ability to mentally process what you're asked to do, what the defense is trying to take away, and where to go based on those two things, and then poise. Those are three key things that I think lead to these. Those are the three pillars of a good quarterback, right? And so I think having the experience in the offense that speaks to his ability to mentally process um, information in a timely manner. I think that's where he's going to have an advantage, a head start um, in sort of this transition to a higher level of competition. There's going to be an adjustment to the speed of the game, which Dampier acknowledged at Big 12 Media Days when he talked about just how more how much tougher practices were against this Utah defense compared to what it was at New Mexico. And so I think that was interesting to hear. And obviously, you don't want to take the Utah defense for granted. It was a top defensive unit, in the country last year, again, based on a number of metrics. And so, that's good for him to have that practice time, to have that period to acclimate against this speed and size of Big 12 defenses that he's going to face on a consistent basis. But to have that sort of advantage of having the mental side down, you see the poise in his play. Obviously, with his athleticism, he's able to escape in ways that other quarterbacks simply aren't. And I think that is encouraging. And I think what's more encouraging in the sense of just his raw ability to escape pressure and evade it is that he's still looking to make plays down the field. He's still looking to quarterback, even while on the move. And some of his best throws have come while he's on the move. So, there's you want to continue to see that from him, but you want to see just the chemistry. Excuse me. You want to see improvement there, and I think for him going into year two in the system, I think improvement in going through progressions is going to be important. As he has familiarity with the system, obviously building chemistry with his receivers is going to be play a significant role in that, and I think that's going to be a big key for him. Getting into fall camp is establishing chemistry with the two receivers that Utah brought in during spring ball, in Tobias Merriweather and Larry Simmons. I think those two receivers are going to play a very important role for Utah this season because obviously this offense is geared to the run, is geared towards the run game, but you still have to have that vertical presence for defenses to that defenses have to respect in order to get the sort of space you need down in the trenches, to get the sort of timing and sequencing for certain blocks to happen, to be executed properly. And so that's going to be on those receivers to play that sort of role. And for Dampier, that's going to be important to establish that chemistry with those two receivers in particularly, because that's going to be their primary role, is being those intermediate and vertical threats. Utah has a number of guys that can operate underneath, in the short and intermediate areas of the passing game, but they need those deeper. They need access to those deeper parts of the passing game, which is why you brought in Simmons and Merriweather. And so that's going to be a big key for Dampier is establishing that chemistry with those two. And and then there's been a lot of talk with Dampier as a dark horse candidate for the Heisman, and I think it's I understand the logic. Given how he performed last year in New Mexico, he was basically superhuman. He had to be superhuman for New Mexico to have any sort of shot at a win, and I think given how he performed individually with the rushing numbers and with the passing numbers that he put up. If that translates here at Utah and he's putting up the same sort of numbers, we're talking about a historic back-to-back 2 seasons for any sort of quarterback. I think, there's only a handful of players that have produced the numbers that Dampier did last year. Obviously, we're all familiar with the four since 2016 with Lamar Jackson, Kyler Murray, who are the other guys? Jaden Daniels and Jalen Hurts. But there's only I think Whittingham said no other player in college football history has ever done that twice, 2 years in a row. And so there's a historic element to that. And if like I said, if he produces at that same level, which will be a very tall task, obviously, he deserves to be in that conversation, very much so. But I think it's important to understand that Dampier doesn't need to be superhuman like he was at New Mexico last year. He has more talent around him. He has more playmaking ability around him where he just needs to be a guy that can keep the offense on the field, and allow the offense to play a complementary role to everything else that Utah has. So he doesn't need to be superhuman for Utah to regain team success, to get to 8-9 wins. He will have to be superhuman in moments in certain games. There's no doubt about that. But to do it on a week in, week out basis, he does not need to be that. And I hope that Dampier understands that, as he gets ready for the season. And then the last little bit on the quarterback is obviously the QB2 battle with Isaac Wilson and Bird Ficklin. And, that's essentially a battle of experience versus scheme fit. And I think, for Wilson, going back to last year, being put in the situation that he was, it's a pretty tough situation to come into as a true freshman, walking into a starting job of a team that was expected to compete for a conference championship and hoping to contend for a college playoff berth. And, when you have those sort of expectations as a program, especially as an offense, with a quarterback that was going to play at a very high level, it's hard to not sort of feel the pressure to perform at a similar level. And I think that's what we saw with Isaac last year. There were a lot of things that we saw, unfortunately, that weren't good. But I think for Isaac, the key is, last year's experience, it was rough. It was bad. It's how he reacts, how he responds to that experience that he gained. And I think we'll get a good idea of where he's at, what trajectory he's on in fall camp. And I think, there's still talent there. There's still potential there. We try so hard to make these quick assessments, quick judgments of players, after a handful of games, after a season. But there is still a lot of room for Isaac to become the quarterback that we all thought he could be. Not in year one necessarily, but I think that is still important to keep in mind. To give him that space, to give him that patience, I think is key. And then with Bird, kind of a similar, I don't want to say similar story, but similar in the sense that, it's going to be impatient. It's going to be important for him and for others to be patient. Obviously there's a lot of excitement about how he fits in the offense, given his dual threat ability. Watching him, seeing him up close for the first couple of practices, I was really impressed with, his arm and the way that the ball just sort of fired off of his hand. Like he's got a great amount of juice and velocity with his throws. Like the ball just pops off of his hand. And that's really exciting. And then you pair that with his athleticism and you get really excited about what he could become. And I thought, Bird told me in an interview during spring ball that Coach Beck had a really good plan where they just sort of took it concept by concept. He gave him something really basic, really simple. Once he mastered that, they added something else to it. And once he, acclimated to that, they added something else to it. And I think that's going to be important for Bird to continue to embrace that sort of approach. I think, what we learned last year is that, hey, true freshmen coming in, you don't want to get too far out in front of your skis with these kids. You want to give them the time that they need to develop at a comfortable rate, at a comfortable amount of time. And I think that's going to be important for Ficklin to do that himself, to, as much as exciting as it is to compete potentially for the QB2 spot and to become that quarterback, behind the starter and what that means for you as a freshman and your sort of career outlook, that's exciting. But I think it's going to be important for Ficklin himself to not get too far ahead of himself, to continue to take that play by play, day by day type of approach, type of mentality with learning and acclimating and mastering Jason Beck's offense. If he continues to take that approach, that's just going to lead to good things, in the long term for him. And I think that should be the priority for him. So overall, I think this quarterback room, there's a lot of exciting potential with this group, with Devon Dampier and what he can mean to this group. And obviously, a lot of that is going to depend on the pass catchers. And the tight ends specifically are going to play a pretty big role in that. Group, has a lot of potential to potentially become, a three-headed monster of sorts. We've seen a big three at the tight end position in recent years, going back, a few seasons with Cole Fotheringham, Brant Keithy, and Dalton Kincaid. I think there are guys that also sort of represent that as well with Utah. And I'm trying to get this playing correctly. Bear with me here. Let's see. Here we go. Oh, there we go. Tight end. I had to get the overlay correct. But no, this tight end position, I think there's some real potential here with this group. And like I referenced, I think there's a chance that a big three emerges from this group. I think this group is going to be headlined by Hunter Andrews. I think he's on everybody's short list as a breakout candidate, and for good reason. Based on what we saw in spring ball, he was consistently productive, whether through the air, on the ground. He found a way to make an impact each and every practice. And I think there should be a lot of excitement for Hunter Andrews. Now, obviously, it's going to be up to him to perform on Saturdays, to live up to those expectations. But I think there's, the comparisons to Brant Keithy are legit. Given the fact that they both come from Texas, they both played running back in high school. They're both 6'2", they're both 230. They're both really good athletes. They both can catch really well and run routes really well. They're both dynamic in that sense. The comparisons are there, and I think for him, it's an opportunity to step into a role with Brant Keithy moving on, where he can simply assume a lot of that production that is being left behind. Brant was, it's unfortunate how his career ended at Utah with another injury. But, you look at what he was able to do last season. I think he finished with 35 receptions on 54 targets. He had over 500 yards receiving, 6 touchdowns, 65% completion percentage, on those 54 targets, and really added a lot of value with 22 first downs on those 35 receptions. So I think there's going to be pressure for Andrews to come in and sort of assume that role right away. And I think that'll be interesting to see how he handles it. But there is certainly a path for Andrews to become this type of player for Utah. And you think of who else could emerge in that big three. Dallin Bentley is sort of the underappreciated guy in the room. He's a big body at 6'5", 255 pounds. This is a different offense compared to the Ludwig offense, where Ludwig liked multiple tight ends of that build of guys 6'4", 250 pounds, where he also had just the athlete as sort of the complement to those other big builds. I think it's reversed under Beck, where he likes more of the athletic types, the 230, the 240-pound guys, with the big bodies, the 255-pounders, as sort of the complement to those other guys. And I think that's Bentley. I think he can serve as that Cole Fotheringham to a Brant Keithy and to a Dalton Kincaid, as a guy that's going to serve primarily as a blocker, both in the run game and the passing game. But he can be a nice release valve in the passing game, sort of that check down option for Dampier over the middle of the field, where he's averaging 8-9 yards per reception. But you look at what he's doing with those receptions, and he's converting a lot of first downs and playing a vital role in that sense. I think that's what I see for Dallin Bentley. And then the third guy that could potentially emerge in this big three, I look at the two guys that they moved to the tight end position from wide receiver in Otto Tia and J.J. Buchanan, the incoming freshman. These are guys. Otto Tia made the move to tight end, in week 4 of spring ball, where he was splitting his time between receiver and tight end. I think I was told he spent 70% of his time at receiver, 30% of his time at tight end over those final 2 weeks. He's now made the transition to full-time tight end. J.J. Buchanan was going to come into the program as a wide receiver first with the possibility of moving to tight end. He got here right away. Coaches were like, okay, no, you're moving to tight end. We're going to move you there. And I think that's actually a really exciting fit for JJ. So, these are the guys that I sort of view in that Dalton Kincaid type, sort of the flex tight ends that can play in line, that can play out wide, that can play in the slot. And given, obviously, Otto Tia's experience at wide receiver, that makes sense. And he's a big body at 6'4", 235. And so these are the guys that I think can emerge as those potential, forming a potential big three with this tight end position. And it's why I think tight end is still going to be a big point of emphasis. Why that, under Beck. There's been so much talk about the transition from Ludwig to Beck and the tight end position becoming less of an important position group. But I think, with the moves, with the guys that they brought in, with the emergence of Hunter Andrews and the guys that they moved from receiver, I think it says a lot about how Utah still values this position. And I think I'm excited to see how Beck utilizes these guys in this room this season. I think there's a lot of potential for this group. I think Hunter Andrews can assume a lot of that production that is moved on. I think there's room for Otto Tia to become more of that seam stretcher, that vertical threat. Same with JJ, and I think that's sort of how those three can work together. And then the last group is the offensive line. And with this group, let me get it here. Obviously, it's headlined by Spencer Fano and Caleb Lomu, two guys projected as potential day one draft picks in next year's draft. I think that's just an unbelievable thing to have, the ability to say you have two potential first round draft picks and they both play the same position. Hats off to Jim Harding and what he's built there with those two and with that group specifically. You're really excited about what this group can be. And I think for me, this group has the potential to be really special. And, there was an offensive line just a couple years ago that I thought performed at a really special level, and it was Oregon's 2023 offensive line. You remember that season, Bo Nix, I think, he was sacked, 3 times on the year, 2 of which came at the fault of the running back, not even the offensive line. And then Nix, I think, ran for 19 touchdowns and I think 1,000 yards as well. And you look at what Oregon's offensive line looked like, it was very similar to what Utah has going into this season. They had 2 really athletic offensive tackles. They had a brute at center, and those 3 performed at really high levels. And I think that's going to be the key for Utah. For me, the big X factor with this group is Jaron Kump at center. He's got all the physical tools that you could want in an offensive lineman, given his size and frame. He's got a big, wide frame. He's got good athleticism. Injuries have sort of sapped his explosiveness, but there's still a lot of movement, a lot of mobility there. And I think for Jaron, the big thing for him this season is all mentally. It's all mental for him. He's got to take a step mentally, clean things up, get everybody on the same page, and make sure that he's communicating properly what he's seeing, across from him with the defense, what he's IDing, in that sense, and making sure that they've got the proper blocking assignments, on a consistent basis. I think that's going to be the big step. So for me, the big X factor with this group is Jaron Kump, and I think mental development, mental progress in terms of understanding assignments, understanding defenses, and understanding what they're trying to accomplish on a play-in, play-out basis, I think is going to be the big key. And if he's able to take a step forward in that sense, I think that's going to have a really profound impact on how this offensive line performs this season. I think this group has the potential to be really special, to mimic that sort of offensive line that I referenced from Oregon in 23, where you're giving Dampier plenty of time in the pocket. You're being just a complete force in the run game, where you're creating a lot of movement, creating a lot of yardage where running backs aren't getting touched, and I think that should be the goal. That should be the focus, and it's all going to come down to Spencer Fano and Caleb Lomu leading the way, leading by example. When your best players are your best leaders, that is going to have a very positive impact on everybody around them. So I think it's going to be on those two to lead the way. It's going to be on Jaron Kump to make progress. And then, too, another thing, as I looked at that Oregon offensive line from 23, what I was really fascinated by was the number of guys that they utilized over the course of the season. I think they had 8-9 guys that played at least 200 snaps. Now, part of that was out of necessity with injury, but I do think they also rotated guys in pretty consistently. And I think given the depth that Utah has this season with guys like Ike Garcia, Solitao Moiai, Keith Olson, and others like Kalolo Taaga and Alex Harrison, and even the younger guys behind them, there's a lot of depth this season. And I think gaining clarity with where those guys fit best will be important. Getting them reps, I think, will be very important, because there's a very real chance that that Utah has to replace the entire starting unit next year. And so if Utah can find a way to obviously maximize the starting unit, get them performing at a high level, and then incorporating 2 to 3 guys in a rotation and getting them reps, I think that would be really valuable, not only this season, but also next season, where you potentially have to turn the page at all 5 positions. So I think that's going to be really interesting. This is the group. This group will play the biggest role in Utah's success this season. I think it has all the right pieces in place. It's got not only in terms of players, but also coaches. Jim Harding leading the way. Isaac Asiata's return to the program and serving as an offensive line assistant under Harding, I think is something that isn't getting talked about enough. I've talked about it, here and there, but his presence is really important, and it's really valuable because he becomes essentially an extension of Jim Harding, given his credentials and what he's been able to do as a player, both at Utah and in the NFL, and given his ability to build relationships and bonds with these players as a former player himself, I think is really unique. So, all in all, I think there's a lot to like about this offensive line. Obviously, given the fact that you've got 2 guys that are potential first-round draft picks next year, there's a lot of depth with what you have, in the starting unit, and then behind them. And this group is going to be really, really important to Utah's chances this season. They've got to set the tone on a consistent basis. These guys will lead the way for Utah this season. It's vital that they embrace that. They embrace the opportunity to be special this season, and that they strive for it. I think that's going to be the big key for this group, and it'll have a really significant impact on Utah's success this season. So that's what I've got for this episode, wrapping it up, because I've got to get going. It's Kendra's family birthday party this weekend, so we're doing a seafood boil, and I'm excited about that. So got to get stuff going on that front. So appreciate everybody for supporting the Blockcast. Like I said, I'll be back on Monday with another episode previewing the defensive ends, cornerbacks, and safeties, and then hopefully, if there's any other news and notes and that sort of stuff. And then, man, after that, it's fall camp, and we're off and running. So appreciate everybody. For myself, Steve Bartle, the Utah Blockcast.